Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. The title is Stop Focusing on What You Can't Eat and Learn All About What You Can Eat, Healthy Eating with Diabetes. So my name is Katie. I'll be your host, and I will introduce our speaker in just a minute. But we're so happy that you're able to join us live tonight. This is a wonderful topic, a very popular webinar with lots of good information. So thank you for joining us. So our format includes a short presentation followed by an interactive discussion. If you have a question, you all should have a webinar toolbar, probably to the right-hand side of your screen if you're joining us live. So you just use the questions section and then type a question in, and our speaker will probably get to those near the end. We'll definitely save time for a question and answer portion. So just a disclaimer, this presentation is intended to provide general nutrition advice, and it represents the professional opinion of the Cecilia Health Certified Diabetes Care and Education Specialist. This information is not a substitute for medical advice provided by your physicians. Our speaker this evening is Lori Olive. Lori is a registered dietitian and a certified diabetes care and education specialist. She's also one of our health coaches here at Cecilia Health, where she primarily works with patients from Minnesota and also New York. She joins us today from Austin, Texas, where she tells me it's a lovely 70-degree day. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, Lori, and you may take it away.
Thank you, Katie, and hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to log on to learn a little bit more about nutrition related to diabetes. So today, what we're going to talk about is a few different things, and our discussion will include diabetes and nutrition myths, and we'll clarify a few of those that tend to be the more common ones that we hear. We'll also talk about what to eat if you have diabetes. Like the title implied is we want to stop focusing on what we can't eat, and we want to focus on what we can eat. Next, we're also going to talk about how to build better meals. So we're going to talk about kind of what would be not a great choice, and then we can talk about some substitutions for those foods to make it a better choice. So we'll just try to be kind of practical in what we're discussing tonight. And then also, like Katie said, we will have a time for questions at the end. Live questions, so feel free to type them in your chat box and we will try to get to as many as possible. And then also, if you just have a comment that you would like to share, feel free to do that and we can share it with the group. So as it says here at the bottom, we also want to just reiterate the fact that you always want to talk to your healthcare provider before you make any changes to your diabetes treatment plan. That's very important. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started with a few nutrition and diabetes myths that are out there. So the first one says, it's recommended that Americans should eat 2 to 3 cups of vegetables per day. That is actually true. And from my experience as a health coach, I don't see a lot of people eating that many vegetables. So this is kind of a good reminder of how much we actually should be eating in terms of the low carbohydrate vegetables. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go through our presentation. The next myth, which is kind of tied into the first one, is only 25% of Americans meet the recommendation for vegetable consumption each day. And the truth of this is kind of sad, but it's actually 10%. So only 10% of Americans actually get those 2 to 3 cups of vegetables each day. And I'm sure we all have our ideas of why that is. Personally, I think that carbohydrates are just so cheap and readily available that it's difficult. It takes a real conscious effort to get in good, healthy, quality vegetables each day instead of filling up on carbohydrates. Um, the next myth here, it says the best diet for a person with diabetes is a low carbohydrate diet. So this could be a whole webinar on its own, I think. First of all, the first response I would have to this myth is that every one of us are different. Every one of our goals are a little bit different, even though we might all have diabetes. A low carbohydrate diet isn't necessarily the best diet for all of us. The other thing is that, if we look at what is the true definition of a low carbohydrate diet, it depends on who you ask. Some places, like if you look at the keto diet, for example, a low carbohydrate diet by their definition is about 20 grams of carbohydrate per day. I personally have never recommended, as a dietitian, never recommended that low of carb to any of my patients. I think that's too low of carb for a number of reasons. Our body needs those carbohydrates for fuel. Our brain needs carbohydrates. And I think that for those of you who've maybe met with a dietitian before, you've probably found that dietitians are pretty practical. We're not the ones that are going to tell you to try some crazy, very super restrictive diet, because the truth is that most people aren't able to stick with it for very long, if at all. And it's never a good idea to do a quote diet that is something where you dramatically change your diet, because we're all human and it just doesn't tend to lend itself to long-term goals and outcomes. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how much carbohydrate should we really be getting in our diet, but I don't want anyone to feel like they have to be on a very restrictive low carbohydrate diet, because I think for most people that's not the case. So let's talk about our 3 macronutrients in our food. So our foods are made up of carbohydrates, proteins, and or fats. Carbohydrates, as it says here, it provides us the fuel in the form of sugar. Some carry water-soluble vitamins, they carry fiber, they carry antioxidants, and so we have carbohydrates, and that is what someone with diabetes really needs to be paying the most attention to. Now, proteins, let me back up. So the reason that someone with diabetes needs to pay close attention to carbohydrates is because that is the macronutrient that affects the blood sugar the most. Okay, so then we talk about proteins. So some foods are pretty much all protein. Some foods are going to be a combination of protein and fat. Most are. You might have foods that are a combination of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So you're not necessarily going to find these macronutrients by themselves completely. Most of the time, the foods that we eat are a combination of those. But proteins are what provide the building blocks for our cells and the structure in our human body. So proteins are important, carbohydrates are important, good fats are important as well. I think a lot of people, especially maybe as we get older, maybe struggle a little bit with getting enough protein in our diet. So protein has less of an effect on our blood sugar. It actually slows down the absorption of our carbohydrates, and it keeps us full longer. Okay. And then fats provide fuel for our body in the form of fatty acids. Some carry fat-soluble vitamins and good fatty acids like omega-3s. So not all fats are bad, not all fats are good. So we want to focus on the good fats, the monounsaturated fats like the nuts and the avocado. But again, fats slow down the absorption of carbohydrates just like proteins do. So One example where you may have noticed this is, let's say if you've ever experienced a low blood sugar, your doctor's probably told you to drink half a cup of orange juice. Well, that is a very rapidly absorbed carbohydrate with pretty much no protein, no fat. So when your blood sugar is low, you want your blood sugar to come up as quickly as possible. So you want just carbohydrates. You wouldn't necessarily want something that had a lot of protein and fat in it if you had a better choice. Something like a peanut butter sandwich. That would be something you would want once your blood sugar came up. But that protein and the fat that's in the peanut butter is going to slow down how quickly your blood sugar comes up, which for a meal is great, but when your blood sugar is low, not the best thing. So it's just important to understand how protein and fat, along with carbohydrates, affect your blood sugar. So where do we get carbohydrates, proteins, and fats? So carbohydrates come from breads, it comes from fruit, it comes from beans and rice, and like our high carbohydrate vegetables would be peas, corn, potatoes. So not all of the vegetables are high in carbohydrates. But like I said, and then sweets, of course, anything with added sugar is carbohydrate. Protein would be from meat, from fish, poultry, beef, pork, eggs. Those are primarily just protein. And then the fats, like I said, nuts, seeds, avocado, canola oil, olive oil, those are all good fats, but are pretty much just fat. So carbohydrates are pretty much in everything but meats and fats. They're very easy to find. Um, and then this talks about just our nutrients like vitamins and minerals and water. So, all of these vitamins and minerals are important from the different foods that we eat. The calcium, we need the iron, we need the zinc, the magnesium. So anytime you start restricting your diet from any food group or source of calories like carbohydrates, you start becoming a little bit deficient, or you could over time, or just you may not be getting enough of these nutrients that we're getting in our carbohydrates. Okay, so we don't want to restrict too much. Okay, so let's talk about how much carbohydrate should we be getting in our meals? So this is very dependent upon the person, just like calorie needs are very dependent on the person. So a 5-foot, 110-pound woman is obviously not going to have the same calorie and carbohydrate requirements as a 6'2" man that weighs 220 pounds. So there's going to be differences. So here we're talking about just general guidelines to kind of give you a place to start when planning your meals. So for men, generally speaking, about 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per meal is a good place to start. If your doctor has said that he or she wants you to be having snacks during the day, a good snack would be between 50 and 35 grams, or sorry, 15 and 30 grams of carbohydrate. And then for women, a little bit less, so more like 30 to 45 grams of carbohydrate per meal, and snacks then would be 0 to 15 grams. So in addition to how much you weigh and how tall you are and your age, it also kind of depends on what kind of medication you're on. So that's why it's hard to say exactly how much, when I'm speaking to a large audience, how much carbohydrate you should be getting. So it kind of depends on the person. So for something more specific, it's good to talk to your doctor, your healthcare provider. If you can meet with a dietitian individually, that's certainly helpful to find out what works for you based on how your diabetes, along with your medication, responds, and how your blood sugars do with different amounts of carbohydrates. So how do you learn how much carbohydrate is in your food? So the first place I always tell people to look is on your food label. There's actually a picture on the next slide, and we'll look at this a little bit more, but food labels are very important. We can count on those food labels being accurate. So that is always the best place to look. So if you have a food label, on the foods that you're eating, or even the ingredients, it's a good place that would be the best place to look. Sometimes foods don't have labels though, like an apple or an orange. Fresh fruits and vegetables that you're buying at the grocery store don't come with labels. So how do you figure out how much carbohydrates in those foods? So you can go on Google. If you, like most people have a smartphone, you can go onto Google and search how many carbs are in an apple. So it will say maybe 15 grams of carbohydrate, or it might say 30 grams of carbohydrate. It depends on the size of the apple too, right? Because some apples are small, some apples are pretty big. So that has to be taken into consideration. But for the most part, if you think about like the size of a tennis ball, an apple that size, which I would say is a small apple, that's going to be about 15 grams of carbohydrate. So you kind of, on some things, have to look at the size, just like a banana as well. You know that bananas, some of them are small and sometimes they're really large. So half of a medium banana would be one carbohydrate serving, or 15 grams of carbohydrate. Um, so some people also, if you have Siri turned on your phone, you can actually say, hey Siri, how much carbohydrate is in an apple? And some people really like using Siri that way. So it may not be as accurate and specific as looking at a food label, but it's still going to give you a general idea if you're just not sure at all. Um, the other thing you can do is try using an app on your phone. MyFitnessPal is one that most dietitians like to recommend to their patients. It's a pretty accurate database, and that's what you want. You want to find something that has a good sized database where most of the foods that you eat you're able to find on that app, and that it also gives you accurate information. So MyFitnessPal is certainly one that's been around for a while and would give you good information. Calorie King is also a good app. There's also a book. A lot of you probably heard of this one. It's a pretty cheap book. I think it's about $8, and it has just a ton of foods in there that you can look up and find the carb amount in. But if you can find a label, it's always best to check out a food label. So then let's talk about what to look at when you have a label. So if there are only two things you're going to look at on your label, I would say look at the serving size and look at the total carbohydrate, because you have to know, first of all, how much of this product are they talking about. So let's say you get a little bag of chips and you're going to eat the whole thing, but it says serving size half of a bag. Then that means you obviously have to double that total carbohydrate number to tell you how much carb you just ate if you ate the whole bag. So always check that serving size. And then if you see here on the screen, it says serving size 2/3 of a cup, 55 grams. I wish it didn't have that 55 grams sometimes, because it confuses most people more than it helps them. But the 55 grams is not the carbohydrate, it's actually the weight. So if you want to be very specific, and sometimes it's hard to judge what the serving size is that it tells you, so you can actually put your food on a scale, and that 2/3 of a cup of this particular product is 55 grams on a scale. But we just want to look at 2/3 of a cup, and then we look at total carbohydrate. And here in this example, it is 37 grams of carb. Let me move something out of my way here on my screen. There we go. And so it says 35 grams of carb and then 13%. I don't even want to get into what that 13% means, because again, that is probably more confusing than it's worth. But you'll notice underneath total carbohydrate, so it says 37 grams of carb, and then it's indented underneath it, and it says dietary fiber is 4 grams, total sugar is 12 grams, and then below that it says includes 10 grams of added sugar. So I've noticed a lot of my patients that have maybe never been told this tend to look at total sugar. So as someone with diabetes, it's actually the total carbohydrate that is affecting your blood sugar. Fiber, not as much, so it depends on how much fiber is in that total carb. That can get a little confusing. So for today's purposes, I'm going to say just look at that total carbohydrate. and that is how many grams is going to be affecting your blood sugar. Okay, so in this case, 2/3 of a cup is has 37 grams of total carbohydrate. Okay, so I don't want to confuse, but if you notice, if you look underneath, so sometimes people say, well, it says 37 grams of carbohydrate, there's 4 grams of fiber, 12 grams of sugar. That doesn't add up to 37. No, it doesn't. And what that means is that the remainder of, like, I think 21 grams of carb would be coming from some other form of carbohydrate. And that's why it's important to look at the total carbohydrate number, because there is other carbohydrate in there that will affect the blood sugar. It's just not necessarily all listed and broken down for you on the label. So, but if you just look at total carbohydrate, the grams, then that's an accurate number for you. Okay, if I've confused you, feel free to ask a question in the comments and ask me to go over that again. I'd be happy to. Okay, all right, let me go back. Okay, so let's talk about kind of a sample meal. So one way that we teach someone maybe that's newly diagnosed with diabetes, how to start learning about carbohydrates and how to start paying attention to the amount of carbohydrates in their diet is by starting with what's called a plate method. So on your plate, in this concept, you want to think about your plate being split in half down the middle, and half of your plate really needs to be low carbohydrate vegetables, as in this picture here. So a salad, this one has a salad with some broccoli. So these are all cucumbers and iceberg lettuce and maybe some onions, green peppers. So these are all low carbohydrate vegetables. They have fiber in them that's going to fill you up so that you're not hungry from eating just a small amount of carbohydrates. But it's just kind of a habit that you have to start with, thinking about splitting up your plate, filling up half of it with salad or low carbohydrate vegetables. And then on the other half of your plate, you want to split that half of your plate. So 1/4 of it would be your carbohydrates and 1/4 of it would be your protein. Okay. So that's kind of just visually an easy way to kind of balance out your meals and kind of get that portion of carbohydrates to the rest of your meals where it needs to be. It's a great way to eat. I mean, you're gonna feel full for the most part. You're going to feel satisfied without eating a lot of carbohydrates, but it may be it may be pretty different than how you have normally been eating. But this is a good, simple, kind of basic way to start where if you get kind of bogged down with counting carbohydrates, which can be kind of tedious, this is a good place to start by just using this method here called the plate method. Okay. And if you have any questions about that, we certainly can come back to this as well and ask some questions. So let's let's think about planning a breakfast to start with. So if we say half of your plate, we want to keep it pretty low carb. And in this example, it's just, we'll say just add a small piece of fruit or leave that side of it empty. So we might add 1 piece of small fruit, and that would be about 15 grams of carb. And then we look at the other side of the plate, and 1/4 of that would be our starch. So a good choice here would be some high fiber cereal, maybe some oatmeal, a slice of whole wheat bread. That's going to give us some good nutrients along with some fiber, which is going to be good for satiety and also just cholesterol levels overall. And then that other 1/4 of our plate is going to be some kind of low-fat proteins, which are going to be better than some choices, of course. So cottage cheese is a good choice, an egg, also like low-fat peanut butter or natural peanut butter. So again, you still have carbohydrates, right? The goal is not to cut carbohydrates out. Even though carbohydrates are what raise the blood sugar, a lot of times the first question people ask me is, so that means I can't have them? And no, that's absolutely not the case. So we still have to have carbohydrates. We want to have carbohydrates in our diet, and it's not even reasonable to not have carbohydrates in our diet. So we just have to look at the portions of how much we're getting and balance it out maybe a little bit differently than we have in the past. Okay. And then let's look at lunch or dinner. Okay. So again, we're going to fill up half of our plate with more than one vegetable. So maybe just not one vegetable. Maybe that's what you've done in the past. Maybe just start thinking about having two low carbohydrate vegetables on your plate. So lettuce, okra, carrots, green beans, broccoli, any of those would be fine. Then on the starch, at the top left corner, we have corn, peas, potatoes, sweet potatoes or yams, brown rice. All of those would count. Even though some of them are vegetables, they're going to count as our higher carbohydrate starchy vegetables. Okay. And then in the other corner, we have our protein. So our fish, our chicken, our beef, and ideally baked, broiled, boiled, or steamed is a better way to prepare as opposed to fried. Now, sometimes, let's say you buy a packaged, let's say like a chicken fried steak from the grocery store. And even though meat itself doesn't have carbohydrate, but you look at the package and you say that there's carbohydrate there, you have to stop and think, well, where does that come from? It comes from the breading, right? So fish by itself doesn't have carbohydrate, but certainly if you add cornmeal or you add some kind of breading to it, then you're adding carbohydrate to it. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're adding a sauce or if there is a sauce added to your meat at a restaurant, a lot of times that can contain carbohydrate if there's sugar in it, if there's, if it's sweet at all. A lot of like barbecue sauces have sugar in it. So it's good to just to take a look at labels as you eat foods at home, especially so that you get familiar with where those carbohydrates are coming from. Okay, so let's talk some specifics about breakfast. So instead of having a large bowl of cereal, okay, let's say like Cheerios or hopefully not Frosted Flakes, but so like something like Frosted Flakes, that is a sweetened cereal. So the flakes have carbohydrate and the sugar is even more carbohydrate. So something like that is going to be a really high carbohydrate cereal instead of whole milk, which has the most amount of fat, right? I know a lot of people where I'm from like to drink real milk is what is called, or what people call it, and they're referring to whole milk. So it's going to be full fat. It's going to have the most amount of saturated fat of the different types of milk. So skim is going to be a better milk than the whole milk. So in this example, we have large bowl of cereal, whole milk, banana, and a large glass of juice. So that meal together, even though doesn't seem unhealthy, it's going to have about 90 grams of carbohydrate. So for most people, that's going to be too much carbohydrate. So instead, let's modify that a little bit and have a smaller bowl of a high fiber cereal. So fiber, like I said, it is a carbohydrate, but it has less effect on your blood sugar. Instead of whole milk, maybe swap that out and have low-fat milk, so skim or 1%, or Greek yogurt is a good substitute there. And a handful of berries. So a lot of our berries, like strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, are going to be, they have more fiber and a little bit less sugar, so a lower impact on our blood sugar. And then a boiled egg to give us some protein, right? So that's going to have about half the carbohydrates, so about 45 grams of carbohydrates instead of 90, and still a satisfying breakfast that's going to hold you over and not make you hungry by an hour and a half later. Let's see. So this one also, 1 cup of old-fashioned oats, 1 tablespoon of chopped walnuts, 1 tablespoon of ground flaxseed, half a banana. So that, you could say that looks like a pretty healthy, good breakfast, which it is, but it has 45 grams of carbohydrates. So maybe you found that 45 grams of carbohydrates is too much for your breakfast. So you need something that's a little bit lower in carbohydrates. So you might consider scrambled eggs and adding some onions and bell peppers, and maybe have some sliced tomatoes, have one slice of toast with that. So you've got a good amount of protein and vegetables here with some fiber, but still having some carb, but not as much. And that can be very satisfying as well. I actually had a patient the other day tell me she has salad every morning. I'm like, well, who said you can't have salad, right? So, I mean, I like salad. Why not have it for breakfast? Nobody said you couldn't have it. Okay, so let's go through a couple lunch ideas as well. So instead of a bacon cheeseburger, a large order of fries, and a large regular soda, which I hope none of you are having, especially that regular soda, that meal comes to 195 grams of carbohydrates. That's a lot of carbohydrates. Um, Instead of that, we can do so much better than that. Maybe try a Southwest salad with grilled chicken, with a salad dressing. So that together is going to fill you up. It tastes good. It tastes so much better than all that grease and sugar. And it only has 40 grams of carbohydrate. So much better for your blood sugar. Or if you still are at that restaurant and there aren't salads, so maybe you have a small burger, a kid's burger. You would be surprised how many people have switched to a kid's meal that I've talked to, and they still have their burger, they still have some fries. Maybe they have the apples, sliced apples, like at McDonald's. I think this is what it's referring to. You can choose to get sliced apples instead of extra fries, and then have an unsweetened iced tea. That's only about 65 grams of carbohydrate. So it might still be a little bit higher in carb than some of you might need, but certainly better than this first option of 195 grams of carbohydrate. Okay. So another idea at home for lunch is just make a big green salad with a cup of chopped vegetables, half a cup of beans, give you some carbohydrates there, a tablespoon of sliced almonds, that gives you some fat and some fiber, 1 cup of fresh strawberries, still some carb, but that's okay, vinegar and oil dressing, so that's about 40 grams of carbohydrate. Um, so this last one here is a little bit of Mexican food, right? I live in South Texas, and we always use the tortillas and salsa and enchiladas and rice and beans as an example of how much carbohydrate you can get in a meal that's not uncommon. But a good substitute for that would be using corn tortillas instead of flour tortillas. Flour tortillas have quite a bit more carb than corn tortillas. You can make tacos with leftover grilled chicken, maybe from the night before. Still have a little bit of beans, that's okay. A quarter of avocado for some good monounsaturated fats, and some pico de gallo to give it some good flavor, and just chopped vegetables, tomatoes and onions, add some flavor, and it's only 40 grams of carbohydrates. So that's still a good meal. So again, instead of this, try this. So instead of a chicken fried steak with a cup of mashed potatoes and half a cup of corn and a small roll, with some sweet tea, which there aren't too many foods I tell people with diabetes not to have, but those sweetened drinks like regular soda or sweetened tea, which is the same thing as a regular soda, that can add up the carbs so fast and shoot your blood sugar up so fast. It's really not a great idea. So this meal with the corn, the roll, the tea, the potatoes, all of that, plus your breading on your chicken fried steak, that comes out to about 115 grams of carbohydrates. So that's almost a day's worth of carbohydrates for some people. But you could do like a lean grilled steak, a small baked potato with some broccoli. So choose a low carbohydrate vegetable plus a salad, and then unsweetened tea. It makes a huge difference. It's only 40 grams of carbohydrates. So a lot of times it's just swapping things out. You can still have some of what you wanted, but just substitute out some things. And a lot of times you'll find you prefer these things after you get in the habit of eating the lower carbohydrate options. Okay. Another idea here you might like is grilled salmon with a cup of roasted winter vegetables, a cup of steamed spinach or other greens, and sparkling water, which is only about 40 grams of carbohydrates. Stir-fried chicken with 2/3 of cup of brown rice with some stir-fried vegetables like your cabbage or, oops, sorry about that. Cabbage, celery, onions, mushrooms, peppers, green beans. Those are all low carbohydrate vegetables. Cup of hot tea. That all comes to only 45 grams of carbohydrates. So when you start adding a lot of low carbohydrate vegetables, you find that it's actually can be quite a bit of food. So then that's a good thing. So again, this is just another visual of the plate method that I mentioned earlier for meal planning. Half of your plate being the non-starchy vegetables, quarter of your plate being the lean meat, and a quarter of your plate being your carbs, your whole grains or your starchy vegetables. Okay. So the bottom line to all of this is there really aren't any foods that are off limits when you have diabetes, but it's just important to pay attention to your portion control, watch how much of those carbs you're getting, and just start making healthier food choices just a little bit at a time. You never want to do anything super drastic because it just makes it more stressful for you and more difficult to stick to. And just remember, carbohydrates aren't bad. There aren't good foods and there aren't bad foods. A lot of times people will ask me that, is this bad for you? Is that bad for you? I don't like to call anything bad, okay? Because in and of itself, it's not bad. But carbohydrates are what raise your blood sugar. So you need to just learn how much carbohydrate can you eat and still keep your blood sugar controlled. And then just also remember whole carbohydrates as opposed to simple carbohydrates, things that have more fiber in them are going to provide you some more nutritional value than more simple carbohydrates or refined carbohydrates. And then, you know, the plate method is just a good place to start. Carbohydrate counting is a more complicated way of doing it, certainly a great way to do it, but if that's a little too intense for you, it's a good idea just to start with the plate method in terms of meal planning. Okay, so what I'd like to do is first I'd like to just remind you of a couple other upcoming webinars that we have planned out. If you're going to be talking to your diabetes coach here in the next couple of weeks, you can just let them know that you're interested and they can send you a link to the schedule and the link to get you registered. So in April, our topic is going to be say no to diabetes complications and say yes to reducing your risk. So keeping your kidneys, nerves, and your eyes healthy. And then in May, our topic is going to be safe and smart exercises for people with diabetes. So always a good idea to be reminded of those. So that is all of the content that I had for you tonight. I hope you've enjoyed our webinar. I certainly appreciate you being here and your attention. And what I'd like to do now is just go ahead and open it up for questions if you have any. Okay, so the first question that came in from Lisa says, is it okay to skip meals? So generally speaking, I would say no. For a couple of different reasons. Again, everybody is individual and that might not necessarily be the answer for you, but the first thing you want to consider is, does the medication that you're taking for diabetes, does it cause your blood sugars to drop? Do you sometimes experience low blood sugars if you were to skip a meal? If you could answer that yes, I would say you really need to try to avoid skipping a meal, because if you're taking that medication and it's there to match the carbohydrates that you normally consume at breakfast, for example, or at lunch, then if you don't put those carbohydrates in your body, then you're likely going to see a drop in your blood sugar. So you want to be careful doing that. There are certainly exceptions to that answer, and so I would say talk to your healthcare provider about that, but my main concern would be whether or not someone is putting themselves at risk for a low blood sugar. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions. Katie, feel free to forward me any questions that you get. Here's one from Jennifer that says, I noticed that oatmeal makes my blood sugar really spike up. I thought oatmeal was healthy. So again, there's that healthy word. So it is healthy, and you'll see a lot of times on the package that it's good for your cholesterol, which it is. It has fiber, right? Um, some of those packaged oatmeals actually have added sugar in them. So you have to be careful if you're buying those packaged oatmeals. But oatmeal in general, even if it doesn't have added sugar in a packet, even if it's, slow cooked oats that you make at home, um, for a lot of my patients, it does tend to really spike up their blood sugar. So it could be for a couple of reasons. So one, sometimes people find that they have foods that really spike their blood sugar, even if it's not something that typically spikes everybody's blood sugar. So there's that. Oatmeal, however, does kind of have, it's not uncommon. It kind of has a reputation for that. It's not uncommon for oatmeal to spike up the blood sugar. If someone tells me that, I usually say, well, do you add anything to your oatmeal? Because a lot of times we forget, like, okay, I eat oatmeal, but oh, that's true. I do add berries, or I do add syrup, or I do add, something else that's actually carbohydrate to that oatmeal, but it's not uncommon for it to spike your blood sugar. And so how would you know that? Like, if you don't wear a glucose sensor, how would you know whether or not it spikes up your blood sugar? Well, you can test your blood sugar before the meal and then test it 2 hours after. Okay, we want your blood sugar to come back down to where it started 2 hours after. If you're noticing a huge spike, then maybe that's something where you need to add some protein to that breakfast instead of eating oatmeal by itself. Just remember that protein slows down the absorption of carbohydrates, so you're going to see less of a spike from the carbs that you eat. Okay, and we'll get one more question here. Jim is saying, so you're saying I can never eat a dessert again? So no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I am saying we want to look at carbohydrates that we're getting in our meals. So let's use as an example, let's say you go over to someone's house and you're having dinner and they have a dessert there. So what you would want to do is you want to kind of incorporate the carbohydrates that you're going to get from that dessert into your total carbohydrates that you're getting for that meal. So maybe instead of having that dinner roll, leave that out because you're going to have some carbohydrates from a dessert. So just focus more on the protein, fill up more on the protein and more on the low carbohydrate vegetables. Have a big salad, fill up that plate with salad, and then you can have your cake and eat it too, really. So you might be surprised. A lot of people are surprised that sometimes there's foods that they've told themselves, I can't ever have this again. I have diabetes. Don't do that to yourself. Just figure out how much carbohydrates in it and incorporate it into your meal so that you can still have the things that you like, because that's going to make things easier for you. It's going to be easier to stick to this diet. It's going to be easier to deal with the diabetes, and you don't want to restrict yourself when it's not necessary. So all good questions. Thank you all very much.
So, Lori, there is a question that just came
Okay,
across.
sure.
Yeah, it says fruits have natural sugar. Are there
Mhm.
any fruits that are naturally low in sugar or lower than others?
hmm So I would say the berries, like the strawberries, the blackberries, the raspberries, blueberries, those are the fruits that you can typically have a larger portion of. Um, to equal, you'd have less of a banana or less juice compared to berries because of the amount of fiber in it. So I would focus on the berries and look those up, and you do tend to get a little bit more of those, also because of the water content in them. That kind of helps give you a little bit more portion. So good question. Any others? Okay, well, if no other questions, just know that if any questions have come up, write them down. And the next time you speak to your health coach, you can certainly ask him or her if they can address that for you. But again, thank you so much for your participation this evening. Thank you for all of those who submitted questions. We certainly appreciate it. And good luck to you all. We appreciate it. And always remember, reach out to your health coach for any additional assistance. Thanks so much. Have a good night.